I'm just going to talk. And because I've decided there are 50 slides in charts in the book, and that's quite enough. If anybody wants to read, they can look at it. I'll just set out the broad arguments and in a fairly graphic way, and not go into the 20-25 minutes isn't enough time to go into the detail anyway.
Okay. Yes. Okay, hello, good afternoon to everyone who's joining us at this new economy shortcut, the one that we plan today with you as usual, a little more than 1 hour discussion online, where a lot of people are joining us for essentially a presentation and a discussion of a book which has just been published, which is called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. And the author is with us, Martin Wolf, chief economics commentator of the Financial Times, very well known from around the world, having written about these topics and the crisis of democratic capitalism in the last couple of years, and about the crisis and the big question, where are we standing, and maybe beyond the very obvious challenge that we have in these times by someone like Putin or China. He's very much discussing what may be behind this crisis, our own crisis, and which may be necessary to do. And we are very happy to have Martin Hellwig, who is one of Germany's most renowned and reputed economists, and has been director of the Max Planck Institute for Collective Goods, and has accepted to discuss Martin's book in a minute. And I think I can immediately hand over to Martin without further ado, and let you tell us what are your main thoughts that you present in the book on the crisis of democratic capitalism and how to get out of it. Please, Martin, start.
So first of all, it's a great pleasure and honor to be participating in this discussion with a predominantly German audience. That, for reasons that will become obvious in a minute, seems to me particularly appropriate in certain respects and less so in others. I tend to the view, I hope I'm right, that Germany seems to have just about the most robust democracy of the large Western states nowadays. If I look across the United States, Britain, France, Italy, Poland, they don't look anything like as healthy. So it may well be that a lot of what I say has no direct or immediate response among Germans. And I'd be very interested to know whether that's the case. At the same time, of course, as I will come to in a moment, the question of the stability of democratic institutions and their ability to function successfully, and the threat from reactionary politics and plutocratic interests cannot but be of very profound significance to educated, or indeed any Germans. And that is, in a way, how I start. So what I'm going to do is give you a sort of broad, if you like, rhetorical outline of my book. The book contains about 50 charts. It's very data heavy in the way that much of my writing is, but I'm going to avoid that today. I'm just going to sort of set out what I think is the main thesis of the book, how I view what is happening. I'm going to start off with a quotation, which I discovered in the course of writing the book, and I decided it may be the best way of simplifying my main argument. And the reason I liked it so much is that it comes from Aristotle, and particularly his Politics. Now, a very long time ago, when I was at Oxford, I started off studying classics. So I found the relevance of this quotation to my book quite striking, and it shows that, in a way, nothing really changes. Anyway, the quotation is, "It is clear then that the best partnership in a state is the one which operates through the middle people," by which Aristotle meant the middle class, and also that those states in which the middle element is large and stronger, if possible, than the other two together, by which he meant the very rich, the plutocrats, and the poor, or at any rate stronger than either of them alone, have every chance of having a well-run constitution. And my other starting quote, which is in a way my principle of politics and economics, you can never have anything unalloyed. Anyway, the quotation comes from the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. In Greek, it's "Merden agan," or "nothing in excess." In 1937, my father left Vienna for England. I think many of you may know this. He left on his own, but his immediate family managed by a miracle to escape to Palestine in 1939. Their wider family was stuck in Poland, and apart from one young woman, they all perished in the Holocaust. In May 1940, my mother's father, a self-made Jewish fish merchant, hijacked a trawler in order to take his family to England as the armies poured across the Dutch frontier. He was one of 9. He asked all his brothers and sisters to join him with their families. None came, and their families also all perished. I'm not certain of the numbers, but somewhere between 40 and 50 of my parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins died. And this catastrophe, which was of course part of a much, much wider European catastrophe, was the result of the collapse of civilization. There were many reasons for this, but important, indeed crucial, and in the argument of the book, decisive, was the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression. That was what finally brought Hitler to power. And I concluded from this, and it has motivated my study of economics since, with greater or lesser success, that if people cannot gain a decent standard of living and a reasonable degree of economic stability, a peaceful and stable democratic order becomes hard to sustain. Let me insist, it's a necessary, not a sufficient condition. And that is why the theme of my new book, which I began a long time ago as I tried to struggle with these questions, it began, in fact, when Donald Trump became president of the United States and the lies of the Brexit campaign seized my own country. That is why this book became so important to me. I am not saying that what happened then will happen again or anything like it. I am saying that one must never assume the stability of a civilized democratic order. So let me now go to the first main theme of the book, which is what has come to be called the democratic recession. Remember this: in a liberal democracy, a democracy characterized by individual civil rights, the rule of law, and respect for the rights of the losers and the legitimacy of the winners, fair elections determine who holds power. Attempts by any head of government and state to subvert an election or overturn the vote are treason against the democratic order. Yet that is precisely what Donald Trump attempted to do both before and after the last US presidential elections. He failed. Decent and brave people ensured that. But to this day, despite the midterms, Trump continues to hold the loyalty of his party's base, today perhaps even more so than a few months ago. It is perfectly possible, moreover, that his successor will be worse because more ruthless and more organized. Meanwhile, true conservative stalwarts such as Liz Cheney were defenestrated from the party. Her crime, stating that Trump's big lie, that the outcome of the election was a big lie, is a big lie. Yet how can a democracy survive if people think the only thing that matters is winning? Democracy of any kind has to be founded on moral values, that we are all citizens together, we govern through debate, and allocate power through elections, and we argue honestly. With these values gone, what is left for resolving issues in society but violence? And Trump is, alas, though I think the most significant figure, far from alone. Freedom in the World 2021 from the independent US watchdog Freedom House, which is published every February, reported this last February a 17th consecutive year of decline in the health of liberal democracy worldwide. The democratic recession, noted by Larry Diamond of Stanford and the Hoover Institution well over 1.5 decades ago, is now close to a democratic depression. Indeed, anti-democratic forces are very visible and potent everywhere in the world, including quite clearly Europe. This decline has occurred in all regions of the world, and it's not least in the fragile democracies that emerged after the Cold War. But it is also observable in core Western democracies. And the most important of all, it's the US, which was, after all, the country that saved democracy in the 20th century. So that leads me back to go back to how this liberal democratic system was born and what relationship it has to the capitalism, the market economy that preceded it. According to one well-known database called the Polity4 database, there were, according to their definition, which was simply that power was allocated through elections which were reasonably fair and in which there was a reasonably broad franchise, there were simply no democracies in the world at all 2 centuries ago. Even where republican institutions did exist, the franchise was dramatically restricted on the grounds of sex, race, and wealth. Then in the 19th century, franchises were widened and universal suffrage democracy finally emerged and spread in fits and starts to cover half of the world's countries after 1990, before declining once again in what I've called the democratic recession. This did not, of course, happen everywhere, but it happened in enough important countries to change the world. So the question, obviously, is why did this happen? It is, after all, rather extraordinary that democratic principles were accepted in however limited a fashion by so many countries, starting from zero. It is important to remember that the normal way to structure the economies and politics of complex societies, all the more advanced post-agrarian societies, in fact, post-agrarian revolution societies, has been for power to marry wealth and wealth to marry power. The most powerful people in society were also the richest, and vice versa. Absolute monarchs effectively owned everything. So why on earth did this revolutionary change towards democracy occur in the 19th and 20th centuries? The answer, I argue, lies with the emergence of a marriage between two very different partners, a liberal economy and a democratic polity. Market capitalism and democracy are, I argue, complementary opposites. The market economy and universal suffrage democracy both reject ascribed hereditary status. They embrace the idea that people are entitled to decide important things for themselves. Market capitalism rests on ideals of free labor, individual effort, reward for merit, and the rule of law. Democracy rests on ideals of free discussion and debate among citizens when making those laws. And of course, it also depends on a rule of law. Historically, it's not just a matter of theory, the market economy brought some profound changes. Mass urbanization, the demand for and supply of a more educated workforce, the organization of the working class as a political force, and of course, because of economic growth, an opportunity at least for a positive sum form of politics. Democracies rest on the existence of an economically independent citizenry. That was Aristotle's point. By the way, a point also made much more recently by Hayek. A fully socialized socialist society is, in my view, inevitably a dictatorship, since the ownership of productive assets and the control over them is ultimately vested in the state. In the absence of coordination through competitive and independent markets, the state must be responsible for the allocation of those valuable resources and so control every activity in society. Markets protect democratic politics from such an excessive concentration of power in the state, but democratic politics protects markets from an excessive concentration of wealth by insisting on the interests of the majority. These then are the respects in which the market economy and liberal democracy are complementary. Yet they are also opposites. They are in conflict. Capitalism is, of course, inherently cosmopolitan. The democratic state is essentially territorial. The market is the domain of exit. In Albert Hirschman's famous description, democracy is the domain of voice. The market economy is naturally an egalitarian. Democracy at least rests on an egalitarian premise. Tensions between capitalism and democracy will then inevitably emerge. If the economy fails to serve the interests of the majority, I argue, the sense of shared citizenship is likely to fray and populist demagogues are likely to emerge. Such populism need not be lethal for democracy, so long as it takes the form of a justified, sometimes even fruitful hostility to predatory and corrupt elites. But often, as Jens Werner Müller has argued, it morphs into hostility to pluralism itself, which is an essential and inevitable element in any democracy. In that case, democracy is transformed into a plebiscitary dictatorship. We call it illiberal democracy nowadays. And ultimately, that tends to a dictatorship tout court, in which the dictator claims that le peuple, c'est moi. Alternatively, the concentration of wealth can lead to plutocracy, as wealth is once again transmuted into power, as it has so often been in the past. Indeed, it is quite possible to have predatory autocracy and corrupt plutocracy in uneasy tension. I would argue that was the governing system of the Roman Empire. So how do we get to the situation in which so many high-income democracies, the most successful and consolidated democracies, are showing such signs of dissatisfaction with democratic outcomes? There's a lot in the book about the surveys and which show this, but I won't have time to go into that now. I argue that large rises in inequality and the deteriorating prospects of the old, respectable working and middle classes in core democracies have been slowly breaking the foundations of consent on which democracy rests. The fear of downward mobility, economic and social relative mobility viewed as a relative phenomenon, has created status anxiety and political cynicism. These have then been diverted in many places by right-wing propagandists into cultural and racial resentments, and that's particularly so in highly ethnically diverse societies. This is, of course, not a new phenomenon. It has long been the foundation of the political culture of the American South, which is now the culture of the Republican Party. Mutatis mutandis, this was the foundation, I would argue, of European fascism as well. Those resentments have been greatly aggravated by the emergence of a large and discontented class of university-educated clerics, what Thomas Piketty calls the Brahmins, and this identity army of the left then clashes with the majoritarian, quote-unquote, silent majority identity army of the right, and this increasingly characterizes the politics of many countries. It's all culture, but it's not just culture. The emergence of the new media have facilitated all these trends, but they have not created them. And so a big question is what has happened to create this status anxiety, which I give some references in my book, especially among people who did not go to college. In the long run, I think the most important phenomenon have been economic, rapid deindustrialization, rising inequality and falling productivity growth. I just stress, I've got charts on this in the book, but basically everywhere, the share of industry in civilian employment has declined dramatically over the last 40 years. The industrialized labor force has weakened. Trades unions have generally weakened. Their decline has brought down with them the social democratic parties across much of the Western world. And this, I think, has been a very important cause of the discontent and stress that I talk about. It's quite obvious, I think, in Britain and America in particular. The second big thing that has happened is a marked decline in productivity growth and growth overall. This combines, of course, with the aging of our societies to create a large amount of fiscal stress. And of course, it means inevitably, if you've got productivity growth near zero, less than 1% in 1% or less in all the major developed countries, in some countries near zero, that politics becomes negative sum. At least not really positive sum. So you want to give more to one group of people, you have to give less to others. And this makes political choices very, very difficult. Everybody is very unhappy. Moreover, during the period prior to 2008, as Raghuram Rajan argued, easy credit papered over these trends, but that blew up in the financial crisis. And in my view, the scale and visibility of that crisis and the subsequent rescue of the banks and bankers convinced many people, again, particularly in the US and UK, that their elites were corrupt and incompetent. One of the most important charts in my book, I think, shows how far GDP per head today, that is actually in 2021, we didn't have 2022 when it was finished, is below what people would have expected if the pre-crisis trends had continued. And just to give you an indication, UK GDP per head today is now more than 30% below what it would have been if the pre-crisis trends had continued. And in the US, GDP per head is 20%, sorry, more than 20% below what it would have been if the pre-crisis trend had continued. Interestingly, the only country where the pre-crisis trend and the post-crisis trend are more or less the same is Germany. And I think that that effect, the effect of the crisis and the subsequent austerity and slow growth, is why the Republican establishment and the British Conservatives became so ripe for a populist takeover. The shift towards skill-intensive sectors and technologies, deindustrialization of the labor force, globalization, and the rise of China were the product of powerful economic forces. And these, of course, played an important role in what I've discussed. But I also argue there is substantial evidence of the emergence of a new form of plutocratic rentier capitalism with declining competition, particularly in the US, rising monopoly and unbridled self-seeking by corporate executives. And in the US in particular, the role of money in politics has eroded the tax base and the effectiveness of regulation. It's little wonder people are so cynical about politicians. Now let me get towards the end with where does this democratic capitalism fit into today's world? Branko Milanovic, well-known observer, argues that capitalism is alone. It is the only system that now is held to be functional. Yet what sort of capitalism has won? Milanovic distinguishes between liberal capitalism, and I would call democratic capitalism, and political capitalism, and I would call authoritarian capitalism. But it's important to understand that in the current world, we face two forms of authoritarian capitalism, which are very different. The most frequent version is essentially depends on a hostile takeover of democracies from within. The would-be autocrat eats out democracy in this way, usually starts as a populist demagogue. Features of such regimes, you can see them everywhere, include a narrow circle of trusted servants or cronies, promotion of members of the family, and members of the power ministries who are personally loyal to the leader. Plutocrats in such societies may find it necessary to support the man in charge. Ultimately, however, they survive only as his cronies. And by the way, they are all men. The other challenger is what one might call bureaucratic authoritarian capitalism, i.e. the Chinese system. A communist bureaucracy operating a capitalist economy may be, it appears, self-disciplined, long-sighted, technocratic, and rational. Even so, bureaucratic capitalism also suffers from the vices of authoritarianism, especially the tendency towards corruption and crony capitalism. These failings damage both the economy and political legitimacy. Bureaucratic authoritarian capitalism is a significant challenger to our Western version, but I believe we must not despair. Autocracies remain bad systems. They do not have a structure of accountability. They do not have open debate. They cannot ensure the peaceful transfer of power, and they tend towards unbridled cronyism and corruption. Indeed, corruption too often becomes the system. Moreover, we should remember liberal democracy has come through many challenges over the past century. And more fundamentally, I believe it is still the right system. It rests on the magnificent belief in the rights of people to make up their own minds and lead the lives they choose within societies whose joint decisions are taken with the active consent of the government. So my very last thoughts is on renewal. I think of course, it's always about policy, but it's also about politics, and politics has to be animated by an idea. It's not just about interests. And my idea is that of citizenship. If democracy is to work, we cannot think ourselves only as consumers, workers, business owners, savers, or investors. We must think of ourselves as citizens. And today, citizenship has to have at least three fundamental aspects: loyalty to democratic, political, and legal institutions, and the values of open debate and tolerance that underpin them, a concern for, an active concern for the ability of fellow citizens to live a fulfilled life, and the desire to create an economy that allows those citizens to flourish. And with that, I will cease my introduction of my book and hand over to the discussant. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much. Yeah, I hand over directly to Martin Hellwig. Please, your comments.
Thank you very much. Is this okay? Sound?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you very much. It's a very great honor to be asked to discuss Martin Wolf's book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, and his presentation. It's a very impressive achievement. Of course, I can touch only on very few aspects of it. But then Martin himself has done a marvelous job of explaining the things that really move him and explaining some of the analysis in that book. The book itself has basically three parts. The first one, the miracles of the marriage of democracy and capitalism. Second one, disillusionment and crisis. And the third one, ideas for renewal. On all three, I'm in wide agreement with him. There are few differences. And at some level, I'm even more pessimistic than Martin is, because the key question of who is to implement renewal, I think, is not easy to answer. Having myself published a book on banking reform 10 years ago, not being able to answer the question, who is to engineer banking reform, I have the experience that this is a serious issue. I want to talk a little bit about the conceptual foundations of Martin's analysis. He has these two key concepts, liberal democracy and free market capitalism. The first one characterized by universal suffrage, representative government, and a peaceful competition of parties for power. The second one And there I would actually have liked to see a bit more, and I'll explain why. The form of the market economy that has emerged, including globalization, freedom from coercion, freedom to buy and sell. Now, should I think of these two concepts as ideal types and abstraction of features of democracy and free market capitalism that we observe in the real world? Or should I think of them as the narratives about the real world that are being used in policy debates or in high school teaching? That distinction is relevant for understanding the notion of delegitimization, because it makes a difference whether we talk about the delegitimization of the actual constitution, of the actual government and the actual markets, or of the delegitimization of the narratives about them. And one of the features of the development that we've seen is a disappearance of respect for truth, a disappearance of the notion that discussion is an attempt to get closer to truth by measuring different approaches against each other. And the notion of alternative facts has come to play a big role in the media and in public discourse altogether. Now, in Martin's analysis, the concepts of liberal democracy and free market capitalism have some parallels. They share a core value, namely a belief in the value of human agency and the idea of equality in status. That's an axiom that I find hard to accept. Even someone like Thomas Jefferson, who was quite strong on formulating such ideas, didn't abandon slavery. And if I think about people like J.P. Morgan or Alfred Krupp, while they loved to be active in markets that did not restrain them, they had no idea of equality and not much of an idea of freedom for others. In fact, cartelization was intended to destroy them. I come to a semantic point. In English, and I mean, I've made this point on other occasions, so nothing new for Martin. In English, capitalism is by and large synonymous with the market economy. On the continent, capitalism is something much more evil than that. And one of the relevant historical issues is actually why the views are so different in the English-speaking world, in particular England, and on the continent. Rodel, the historian, wrote about capitalism and capitalists as people after power who used their abilities to trade back and forth to attain money and power without any acceptance of equality or any acceptance of rules other than those that other capitalists and he might have agreed to. The Dutch East India Company was a wonderful corporation, but it was bent on subjugating the Spice Islands, including destroying populations and enslaving people. If I look at cities like Venice and Lübeck, that was capitalists taking over the state, or basically running the state. And to some extent, this notion that capitalists are, especially successful capitalists, are a key part of the management of power is something that gets lost when we talk about the notion of equality of status. Cartelization in Germany came from an alliance of the coal and steel barons with the East Albion agrarian nobility, and Bismarck loved that. In the US, the robber barons of the late 19th century had similar attitudes to government as the war barons in Germany. All of these newly growing elites emulated aristocratic habits. The UK is the one country where they succeeded much less, largely because the landed aristocracy in the UK continued and still continues to play a significant role in the social hierarchy. I was once told that the greater liberalism of UK law with respect to hostile takeovers of corporations had to do with the fact that corporate leaders in the UK were not at the top of the social hierarchy. Bismarck and the cartels recalls Walter Scheidel's discussion, and Martin implicitly referred to that, of the standard alliance of economic and political powers at the expense of everyone else. From Scheidel's perspective, the nice era that Martin described was a historical exception. The exception may actually be rooted in the beginning of, the first half of the 20th century. There is a very interesting paper by Perotti and von Tappen some 18 years ago, arguing that corporate governance mechanisms in OECD countries depended on the fate of the country in World War I. That in a country like Germany or France, corporations, economic corporations, were basically legislated to serve the state as assistance in matters of social policy following the destruction and all the needs to take care of people. In Scheidel's analysis, the need to mobilize large forces in World War I, World War II, and the Cold War required the elites to permit a greater participation of the masses, which has been changed, all of which has been changed since 1970. So let me now go a little bit more into the question of who are we talking about. Martin was using the word globalization as a feature of free market capitalism. Well, globalization for the past 25 years has had victims. The advent of China into the WTO, the opening of Western Europe to the transition countries, has led to significant shifts in comparative advantage and has contributed much to deindustrialization. So if globalization is in fact a feature of what we mean by free market capitalism, we have one root of disillusionment right there. looking at this from the perspective of normal people, the opening of trade and the deindustrialization went along with the development of the bonus culture and enrichment. There's a very simple view that the bosses exploit economic change at the expense of the people who lose their jobs and the communities that lose their jobs. We must think about the role of elites in these liberalizations. And one of the telling moments was in the early 2000s, well, late 90s, early 2000s, the debate about the Services Directive of the EU. So one liberalization step, which met huge resistance from people who had been for integration all along, who had benefited from the opening of goods markets, and all of a sudden were threatened with the opening of services markets, including the professions. That involves a further issue which is relevant for the mechanisms that we're talking about. Elites are changing, and we are seeing a conflict between elites. National elites may be disempowered. Having competition that destroys privileges is one thing. Having other elites coming along that succeed better in a globalized world where English is the lingua franca and the ability to live in New York as well as Berlin or London is a factor in success. That gives rise to resentment and contributes to the dynamics that Martin has described. In this context, the key question, why were corporations so successful at freeing themselves from the constraints of the 1920s constructions that Perotti and von Tutten described? Of course, globalization. They go to their capitals and tell the political leaders, in order to succeed in global competition, we need such and such. And if you don't abide, we move away. This raises the question of where to turn for renewal. Oh, I forgot one point. And by the way, part of the disillusionment is the impression that the political leaders are being integrated or corrupted by the economic leaders through money. That basically there are all too many political leaders who don't stay in politics, but leave for a well-paying, high-paying job. Where does this leave room for renewal? One needs to focus on who would be able to mobilize the power. And that's the point on which I'm very skeptical, because both political leaders and economic leaders think that the regime we have is to some extent very much in their favor. One of the points that would be part of the New Deal that Martin described would be to have much more in terms of public investments. The idea that we need public goods and we need public infrastructures has been lost over the past 25 years. And that's a statement that you can corroborate by looking at the numbers. I've been trying to, emphasize this point and have found that even where in theory people agree, the moment there is a question about what to spend money on, no way. And to some extent, political structures have even lost the ability to have efficient public investment. Final comment. The point that I was making about national versus supranational elites raises a question about Martin's emphasis on citizenship. Supranational elites do not make good citizens, or rarely they make for good citizens. And on that, I want to stop.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, maybe Martin, you would like to react on some of the points that Martin Hellwig just made, maybe on these supranational elites that may be inappropriate to handle with a lot of problems.
Well, I think we don't have much time, so I want to allow other people to speak. Martin's made a whole host of fascinating questions. And I don't want to go into the last 400 years or what I mean by status and so forth. But there are two things that I did think about. And maybe this is a profound difference in perspective, or maybe it isn't. Yeah, one thought I had is that he has stressed, which I haven't, and I think that was a mistake, the role of the wars, including the Cold War, in cementing the sense of national solidarity. And of course, if you believe, as many people do, that we're now beginning a multi-generation long period of rivalry between some sort of Western democratic order, if you think that exists, and China, well, maybe that's what's going to do the trick. It's going to force elites to take into account the interests of the great majority. I can think of quite powerful arguments against that, because in a post-industrial society, the productive base is very different from the industrial society, and therefore the interests, and similarly mass armies aren't of importance either. So it may well be that that sort of sense of shared interest will not re-emerge. But then that gets to your question, which is the nature of globalization and the sense of national allegiance, even among global elites. They basically know, I think, pretty well where they are, as it were, at home. One of the most striking things, to just take an example, though I wasn't there, the China Development Forum occurred a week or so ago. And the number, I'm told, it's pretty clear, the number of leading American businessmen who were there has dramatically reduced since the last meeting in 2019, and even more so from before that. And the reason, of course, is that geopolitics, are transforming this possibility of thinking of themselves as purely as true citizens of the world. One of the reasons I stress democracy is, of course, it is, as I said, territorial. But ultimately, in my view, all businesses are rooted in a country or a set of countries which have certain cultures in which politics is powerful in determining what they are able to do. And I am not as pessimistic as Martin is about the capacity of national politicians, particularly in the current environment, but even more so in influencing the way in response to the interests and demands of the people at large, the way in which business operates. It's clearly difficult, but there are plenty of examples in history when they have done so. And one of the best examples, since he was talking about the robber barons, was the reaction against the robber barons in the early 20th century, associated with the Sherman Act, the competition laws, the whole hostility to the plutocrats of Teddy Roosevelt and later Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I think those developments indicate that politics is not, in fact, completely in chain to economic power, because economic power ultimately requires political control. And unlike, and this is the big difference, I think, from the aristocrats of old, they don't have the armies, as it were. The coercive power of the state does not rest, in fact, in the hands of our plutocrats. So I'm more optimistic than Martin. I hope I'm right to be more optimistic, but I certainly don't accept that there is no role for national politics in shaping how the economic system works. If I did believe that, I would say democracy obviously is meaningless, and the changing of power in our societies is meaningless because there is no possibility of changing any policy. But I don't actually believe that is correct.
Martin, you would maybe react on that, or is that just slight disagreement?
Just to comment that the Sherman Act followed a long tradition of jurisdiction, both English and American, against price fixing. And the Sherman Act came at about the same time as the German highest court decreed that cartels were not only legal, but legally binding. So it very much depends on the polity in which one is, and histories of different societies and different countries can differ quite a lot in this respect. This gets me back to the Perotti von Duden paper, the sort of structure of an economy with oligopolies that have strong hierarchies and a lot of taxation that of many different forms to extract resources in order to redistribute, to provide for some redistribution inside corporations and in society altogether. That's sort of one deep-rooted structure. The US had something like that in the 50s and 60s, and it has by and large been much reduced for reasons that you discuss in your book and that I briefly touched upon in my discussion. So I think we need to see the historical contingency of certain interactions and take that seriously.
Okay, Martin, if I may ask and test your optimism, is there anything you would sense in what's happening in the US and what Biden is doing that maybe be seen as a proof of that national governments may act and in the way that you describe? You told us in the beginning that you are not too optimistic on despite the midterm elections and on Trump. But anyway, it seems as if something is going on. And would that be in the right direction? And is that in the right direction to prove that national governments may do something?
I think there are two quite different questions here. Do I think that the policy of this administration is altogether wise? No, I think there are some quite big problems with it. And perhaps the third question, do I think they're doing this, as it were, against the interests of their corporate sector and their plutocrats? I think the answer to that is no, because it will be very difficult to do so. That's part of reality, which I accept, as Martin says. But I do think they are trying, I suspect they will find it very difficult to do so, but they're trying to create an economy which more people will feel serves their interests, and a wider part of the population will feel serves their interests. And though what they're doing is far too limited, in my view, some of it is potentially quite important. And it may reshape to some degree the political economy of the US in the following respect. It seems to me, and I discussed this at great length, one of the things that has happened in Britain and America, in France very clearly, is the loss of the center-left and center-right, the sort of traditional center, of any allegiance from very large parts of the working class, the old working class. And their shift, because they no longer believe in the center left at all. The left, far left, was discredited by the collapse of communism. And so their allegiance increasingly has gone to right-wing populists. Now, what Biden is clearly trying to do, because he identifies with these people, is to create an economic system and a value system that goes with that, around nationalism, which is frightens me a little, but it's there, which says to these people, you know, I can give you real things that matter to you, and I also respect you, don't despise you, culturally or otherwise, and therefore you should support me and people like me, not somebody like Donald Trump, who's a predatory windbag. Now, we're going to see if that works over the next few years. So one of the next tests, I think, will be the next presidential election. But if there is, to me, my mind, if there is any hope for liberal democracy in the US, or if there's a sort of democracy I would like to see, then that sort of appeal has to be made to work. Whether it will, I genuinely don't know, but I have absolutely no doubt that from the point of view of Biden and his principal assistants in this administration, that is what they're trying to do politically. And I certainly want them to achieve that politically, because a situation in which such a vast proportion of the population, including people who are not, their exception, not particularly well off, as a whole, think that Trump is their man, that's a very, very disturbing position. And so I wanted that to shift.
Mm-hmm. There are some questions from the audience. Martin, Hellwig, would you comment on that, or shall we open?
No, I don't want to comment. Just ask. Go ahead with the questions from the audience.
Okay, so there's one question. Marie Corman, are you now able to speak? If not, I can read the question. Yes.
I believe, thank you for giving me the opportunity, but I think Mr. Wolf has answered my question later on in his original statement, so there is no need to come back to this topic. Thank you.
The question was, is China's economic success not challenging the assertion that economic development goes hand in hand with democracy?
Yes, that I think I've answered that, and then the other answer to that will probably take half an hour. So yes, clearly it does, but I believe myself that that was an exceptional period of Chinese policymaking under the direction of an exceptional leader, and China is now returning to normal, and the process of returning to normal is slowly but surely stifling the dynamism of the Chinese economy. Now, we will see whether that is the case 10, 20 years from now. But I think that the combination, as Martin says, the combination of liberal democracy with market capitalism is difficult enough. The combination of market capitalism with full-fledged dictatorship is, I think, even more difficult to sustain over a lengthy period.
Hey, there's a question by Aaron Kerman. Let's check if he's...
Yeah, can you hear me, Thomas? Well, thank you very much, both of you, for the presentations. And Martin Wolf, I have a specific question for you, which is that when you talk about the decline, your measures come back to the traditional ones. You talk about productivity declining or talk about GDP declining and so forth. But in the world we're living in, and the resource shortages, the environmental problems and so forth, and the general problems of health, are those the appropriate measures to work on the well-being of a society? Or should we not also be worried about other measures which might give us some reason for some optimism in some countries?
I think that's a very good question. I do, in my chapter on reform, refer to multiple possible objectives, and I discuss some of those. I think I'm something of a skeptic on the idea of making well-being the dominant goal of policy making. I can't go through now why I believe that, but obviously aspects of well-being are incredibly important. I believe, however, that having a productive economy and with it a tax base and is a necessary condition for delivering most of the things one wants in terms of welfare. So one of the big problems in Britain, for example, is where I think it's become particularly severe, since we're living in a close to zero productivity growth society, the fiscal system is trapped. Nobody really thinks that any policy changes can be made because politics has become so viciously zero-sum. Now, this then fits in, of course, with this huge question about how far the climate transition can be married with any sort of viable growth policy. I do discuss that. I would say that my discussion on that is polemical, but I myself believe that we're not going to win the debate on climate, and policy is not going to change. In fact, probably not going to change anyway. We're going to continue to disaster if we insist on arguing that the only way we can deal with climate is by sacrificing what most people will see as prosperity. And I don't think radical redistribution in most societies is going to be an effective alternative. So climate change has to be resolved within some form of growth strategy. I discussed that at length. I think all these things are unbelievably difficult. And if I were inclined to be pessimistic, that these will be additional reasons for being as pessimistic as Martin is. But I think these are things that we have to do as well. They can't be done in place of maintaining reasonably robust economies.
There's one question on fiscal issues. Maybe Martin Hellwig, you've been quite clear on the fact that there's the belief or the concept of public investment has been lost. Looking at what happens in the US and in Germany too, with huge packages of investment, isn't it changing already? Isn't there something which is new?
If what we see now continues for 5 years, I would say yes. So far, I suspect that what we see, at least in Germany, is a function of low public deficits, which to some extent has to do with inflation, and the role of investment as the residual quantity that one uses to balance the budget, that one puts on if there is if the government can be generous, and that one switches off if the government must save. That has been so deeply entrenched in the past 40 years. And the problem is, so one consequence of that is that in some areas, like municipalities, they don't even have the personnel anymore, the planning capacity anymore, to go through when the money comes. And in terms of the supply side, supply sort of capacity to provide for construction, to provide for investment goods and the like, has been so much reduced that the first effect of greater demand is a price effect. And we are not in a political regime that is able to maintain a permanently higher flow of new investment and thereby reallocate supplies in that direction.
Martin, any comment on the fiscal side?
I think that's true pretty well universally, as far as I can see. It's particularly bad in the UK. I think one of the things that has happened, and I probably was too optimistic in this, is that the maturity of the welfare state, which imposes very large ongoing spending commitments, and what are, in most countries by historical standards, so they vary across countries, relatively high average tax burdens, and to my mind, exaggerated fear of public debt, particularly in Germany. But that is perhaps tendentious. These things together have made curbing spending overwhelming priority, and inevitably in that situation, the current spending to which people are committed overrides the priority of investment. And we can see that pretty well everywhere, and I expect that to get worse. If we move into an environment in which real interest rates are permanently higher, that's a big question now. That pressure is likely to get worse. Aging is more or less bound to make that pressure worse. So I think it is true that we are finding it very, very difficult everywhere to invest. In Germany's case, it's always seemed to me, I've made this argument many times, really weird, because Germany is a country with vast surplus savings, ongoing surplus savings in the private sector. And it's never seemed to me obvious why Germany collectively, as it were, thinks that investing those surplus savings in rather dodgy investment in the rest of the world, including the rest of Europe, is a better way of using German surplus savings than investing at home. It just strikes me as really weird. And I think it created very significant macroeconomic problems in the European crisis. But Germany is exceptional, not exceptional, but among the large countries, it's exceptional in the combination, there are smaller countries like Switzerland like that, of having all the pressures on public current spending, but at the macro level, having such a stupendously high surplus savings in the private sector. And then the question arises, well, could you use them better than you have been doing? And it seems to be pretty clear from what I see of the real returns you gained on your foreign assets, yes, you could. So that doesn't really make sense to me.
I think that Martin Hellwig more or less agrees on that point. Yes, he does. Maybe to finish, I would like to come back on the one side to the question, despite your criticism that Martin shares, I would share on this German market policy, the fact is that Germany seems to have a relatively small potential for wave of populism. Do you think that will continue? Is there any reason? Is there anything that others can learn from it? And then maybe switching directly to where you're sitting, the UK, is there any reason for optimism looking at what happens in UK policy?
So this is not, my work is not a proper work of history or philosophy, as Martin rightly describes. But I was interested, I was thinking about Martin's description, which of course I just touch on very, very briefly, of the differences between societies. So here is to me, a disturbing possibility, which I've been moving towards, which is that the very things that Martin emphasized were an obstacle to creating liberal democracy in Germany 100 years ago, might now be the reason why liberal democracy is relatively well entrenched in Germany and not subject to the erosion we're seeing in the Anglo-American societies. Why might I argue this? Well, the argument he has made is that there was, in essence, I'm sure this is an unfortunate turn of phrase, that part of the obstacle to moving in the liberal democratic direction in the late 19th and early 20th century in Germany was the profound importance of social hierarchies and corporatist ideas, like cartels. And these were profound obstacles to sort of universal liberalism, liberal egalitarianism, if you like, of which democracy, and there I would insist, is an emanation. So it might, and this is certainly not a familiar argument, there's a book I cited, I can't remember the name of the authors, I apologize for that, which argued that that was the big difference between Germany and Britain in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the social order and of the industrial power that Germany was becoming. Now, that was a problem, very big problem. And obviously what happened in the first half of the 20th century broke this completely. But the new German post-war republic, one of the most successful states in history, seems to have been, so this is with the positive view, incorporated that sort of corporatism, if you like, in what we tend to think of as the social market model, whatever you call it. I know that's a bit controversial. And that is around sharing power, sharing the goodies, preserving stability at all price, at all cost, preserving industry. It's quite conservative in a way. And you could argue that it resisted very powerfully the complete onslaught of Anglo-American Thatcher-Reagan liberalism, what's sometimes called neoliberalism. So it may be that the very ideas and ideologies that were so important in Germany and survived into the post-war democratic structure is now actually not the problem it once was, but the solution, that it provides a credible stabilization of the political order of Germany in the idea of this bond between the people and the state, which neither the hierarchical centralization, bureaucratic centralization of, say, France, or the liberal individualism of America or Britain do. And if that is the case, then that would be a great historical irony. I don't discuss Germany at all, really, in my book, because it seems pretty obviously not a problem. In the sense, I'm not saying this is true, but if I were to list now, I could prove, no doubt I could, the countries I worry about of having neo-fascist rulers in the next 10 years that are important, big countries, Germany will be way, way, way at the bottom of the list. And that may be precisely for the reasons we describe. What Martin was suggesting is things work in one way at one time and in other ways at other times. And I happen to think that is the case.
Yeah, Martin, please.
On the whole, I tend to agree, although I would put the emphasis differently. Namely, federalism plays a huge role. The decentralization of power and of citizen-state relations that comes with federalism plays a role both in terms of citizens having more than one person, more than one setup to look to when they think about government, and in terms of many more people and institutions being involved in central decision-making. One of the things that has struck me about the UK is the development from, I mean, I first spent time in the UK in the 60s, the development from what then seemed to be fairly decentralized party structures to what now comes across as being fairly centralized party structures, combined with a disempowerment of local government. So that any notions of decentralization is much weaker in the UK today than it was 50 years ago.
I think that's correct, by the way. The centralization of the state in Britain has followed French models, which was combined with radical, greater individualism for the people. And I think that's a completely malign combination. It makes people resentful, and they focus all their resentment on the central government. I think that's a pretty big problem. Also, the two-party system is also, I think, a pretty big problem.
Okay, so that answers in partially my question on the UK, maybe.
Well, on the UK, I was so fascinated by the German aspect of this. So one of my big views is that essentially a society, you can never start a society from scratch. So the revolutionary idea is fundamentally ludicrous. So you always start from what you had. The greatest example of this is the Bolshevik revolution, which has ended up 100 years later, or 106 years later, with a society more centralized and despotic even than the one they started off with. Now, so basically British society's future is determined by what it has been over the past. The same is true of America, of course, where bigger conflicts arise. And the extent to which the British can work out, given their economic history and their political history, a way of making their democratic society work better economically, which I think is the crucial point. And that then gets into the long history of why British economy did so poorly over most of the post-war period. And and whether they can match that with a credible political change, I think very much in question. I really don't know the answer to that. But I would say two things have surprised me moderately positively in the last year or two. The system still does two things rather well, which has surprised me. One, we are still pretty good at getting rid of completely impossibly bad political leaders without actually anybody dying in the process. I like that. That's a big attraction of democracy. And the second is, and this goes back a very long time, we are really quite good at incorporating talented outsiders into our society and into our polity. So, one of the two or three most influential politicians in Britain in the 19th century, I think unlikely in Germany, but you can say, was Benjamin Disraeli. And it is really rather extraordinary. But as far as I can see, with absolutely no controversy at all, our prime minister is a Hindu. And that's not really an issue as far as I can see. So that sort of openness, which is a byproduct of a certain form of liberal society and goes back a long way, is still there. And that's quite a big political asset. It makes me feel a little optimism about where we might be going. But on the big economic issues and the governance issues, which Martin brings out, we are really in very, very great difficulty because so much of our economy is concentrated in London and the Southeast, and the rest is really completely failing. The deindustrialization process, which was so profound, has just devastated huge parts of England and Scotland, and we haven't yet found a way of solving that at all. And the same is true, of course, of America.
Many, many thanks, Martin. I think maybe at some point in a way or another, your book will help to find new ways, new solutions, also for the UK. And I mean, your reading is so universal that it's inspiring for any country in any situation. I think it's extremely important to have such books and such reflections, which is going overall and not just focusing on particular issues. Because I think there's a good point that there's something more deeply, more to understand, and which is needed to fight populism, and hoping that your reading of Germany is the right one. I mean, we have a populist party which is gaining at the moment, which is, I mean, far away from other populist parties, but let's hope for your analysis is quite okay. And still we need some political answers in Germany too, as in other countries. And I think you described a lot of them, possible ways. So thank you, Martin and Martin, both, for this very inspiring afternoon, and hope to see you soon, and continuing to follow what you're reading, what you're writing. I just noticed that Martin Hellwig told me, I think I'm allowed to say that
yes,
the book that you wrote on financial markets and on the financial crisis and banking crisis will be updated. You're about to update it 10 years after it's been published. So looking forward to this in these days where financial markets are getting troubled again.
Yes, Martin has always been right on that, and a great guide. And nobody pays him any attention. So no wonder he is so skeptical about progress.
Okay. Thanks both. See you soon.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I treasured it. It was very exciting intellectually, and to talk in front of this audience means a lot to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.